And we welcome you to another episode of Dark Side of the Ring. Tony, Mr. USA Atlas, Lee Versage, and Zach McGibbon here with you. Great to be able to talk to you again, Zach. How are you?
Doing pretty good, Lee. It's should be an interesting episode here with Tony Atlas as we kind of approach this topic. A guy that I've seen obviously in a lot of the WWE documentaries, being a talking voice for their productions and all that, and obviously the one half of the first black WWE tag team champions as well in the WWF, but hadn't really had a chance to really dive deep into the career of Tony Atlas. So interest to see your thoughts on this episode and move forward on it.
Too much too soon, the name of the episode. And yeah, this is a real episode where I think you're going to get hopefully an idea at the end of it, the kind of person that Tony Atlas was. 12 years old, 6 feet tall, 110 pounds, and his father had him fight for money. And that's the way that Tony Atlas grew up. And to me, Zach, I wanted to know a little bit even more of the beginning of the life of Tony Atlas, but it definitely started out as this genetic freak that, quite frankly, people didn't help him the right way when he was young, and I'm not sure it ever got fixed. And that's like, as it starts out, Tony Atlas as a person that was a young man that had a lot thrown at him early because of the way that he looked. He was different, Zach, from everybody else.
Absolutely. He was kind of one of the first people, like you always had guys that were in shape in pro wrestling, but his look was super unique in the fact that he came up through the, obviously how he got his nickname, Mr. USA, that bodybuilding background. That's how he kind of got through the come up and got recognized eventually in pro wrestling, is by having this incredible look. And when you have a promoter that walks by and says, hey, this guy looks like he could be something, and they see a guy with his look, they usually want to try and bring him in and say, hey, let's see if he can work some holds and see if he can be something that we could work with and be a potential future star. So, yeah, they talked about it a little bit there, obviously being Mr. USA, that bodybuilding background, training at Gold's Gym and all that. It's obviously led to his time going into pro wrestling.
So as a young man, kind of fought his way up. And I think one of the things that kind of told me about the person that Tony Atlas was very early was how much, you would think back to the time that he was in late 70s, early 80s, and just a ton of racism that went on. And it never, ever looked like it really bothered him. It's like he understood it. He knew it. And if he wanted to get through it and make money, that's the way that he was going to have to be. And that was one of the big things early, because I think you see when there is a lot of racism, sometimes people can get kind of used to it. And then they build this disdain for people and life because of the way they were treated. And you don't blame them. He never really seemed to have that. It's like he understood what it was, where it was coming from, and it didn't really bother him, Zach.
Yeah, it's one of those mentalities that you kind of see with a lot of pro wrestlers of that time. And, he's not the only black talent that's talked about this as well. When you're going and you're wrestling, especially in the southern parts of the U.S. during that time, it's going to be a real rough time, as they, the South not exactly known for being tolerant throughout its history. And so when he's that time frame that Tony Atlas is coming through, he had to deal with a lot of that. But it is kind of one of those things where, and it's something that a lot of fans, just call them normal people instead of people that are in the wrestling business. What normal people don't really understand is, when it comes to people that are in wrestling, is that it's about making money at the end of the day with a lot of these guys and their mindset and how they approach things. And so in the case of Tony Atlas, it's at the end of the day, am I making money? Am I bringing, putting food on the table? Am I, being able to take care of myself and care for myself with the money that I'm bringing in? It's one of those mindsets that I think for some, it's kind of hard to wrap around, especially with, wrestling is not exactly the most high class of art either. And so when you got that combination of factors, it can be a real tough time. But you see it whenever you talk with an old veteran of any kind during that went through that time. The big thing that they always talk about is kind of drawing money and making the house. And so it kind of goes back to Tony Atlas, the way that he was brought up in the business and learning from people when he was on the come up, that at the end of the day, you're trying to make a lot of money. And I think that's how he was trying to approach it as well when he was going through, despite all the racism that he had to deal with during that time too.
Tommy Rich, Wildfire Tommy Rich. One of the things that I got to learn even more was really the genuine friendship and love that Tony Atlas and Tommy Rich had for each other. I was really intrigued by this, Zach.
Yeah, me too. This was kind of new for me. Tommy Rich, one of the great baby faces, especially territory baby faces, when you go back and watch him, a staple of Georgia Championship Wrestling during his time, Wildfire Tommy Rich, and a former world heavyweight champion of the NWA, I should mention as well. They talked about the friendship that they were able to form and some of the stories that, it's still kind of a crazy story, and of Atlas getting an invitation. It turns out it's an invitation to a Clans meeting is just a crazy story. And they both realized what they were kind of entering into. Not surprising when you consider the background of Dick Murdoch and all the stuff that was surrounding him. It's unfortunately not surprising that it would come from him, but it is still kind of a wild story of them going to that sort of rally and then having to try and survive coming out of that. But it goes back to, when you're on the road together, you see each other a lot and you establish a lot of these friendships. It's what you mentioned there, Lee, in terms of the friendship that they were able to bond with. And in the case of Tony Atlas, somebody that's kind of new to everything. He wasn't like the biggest wrestling fan when he was growing up. So being able to learn through all of that with somebody like Wildfire Tommy Rich, I think was pretty big for Tony Atlas's career.
Yeah, if you want a wild story, make sure you go back and watch, how they got to the KKK meeting.
Yeah.
A little really punched home, I think, something that was noteworthy to me throughout was, unfortunately, the naivety of Tony Atlas showed itself a lot in his life. And I think naivety can be a good thing sometimes because it shields you, but it also can get you into a lot of trouble. And I think we got some examples of exactly that with Tony Atlas, seeing the good in everyone and being a little bit naive. You kind of wish to me more people were like that, but then this is an example of you see how much trouble they can get in.
Yeah, especially in the wrestling business where it can be super cutthroat.
Yeah, no question. But that is a wild story, that how he was able to do that. And I think, for me, Zach, that was the running commentary throughout, is that he didn't have great influences growing up. And, how many stories are there of people that don't have great influences growing up? But then he became a big star. This is like any sport. You can relate this to any sport of somebody coming up, getting a lot of fame and a lot of money and not having good influences and not having a good childhood. And what happens is you rip through the money and you don't really care.
Yeah.
And you live the life. You don't put any money away and you live the life and you're living in the moment. And Tony Atlas is another example of how it all came crashing down and he ended up sleeping on a park bench in Maine for over a year, which is crazy to think about how popular he was. One half of was it Soul Patrol? Is that right?
With Rocky Johnson?
Rocky Johnson and WWF Tag Team Champions, and how popular they were and how much money he was making, press slamming and I'm not going to let this go. Press slamming Hogan. Surprise Hogan allowed himself to get up there.
Yeah. Brother, not too high, brother. I gotta
not too high. But Tony Atlas press slamming Hulk Hogan really made him. And then you see sort of the downfall of, and it's a typical story that way, but it's still sad, right? Of party, not able to handle it, spend too much, and all of a sudden you're out on your feet. You have no money, and Tony Atlas ended up on the streets for a while, and that's fortunately for him. That's not where the story ends, but a real dark time in his life.
Yeah, absolutely. And then he had some short stints as well in the WWF, returning as Saba Simba, which does not age well. Didn't age well when it debuted. It certainly doesn't age well now when you watch it through 2025 eyes. And then he had a brief run in WCW, but like what you mentioned, just living on a park bench, homeless, spending all of his money throughout his career on partying and not being able to take care of himself at home. And this is one of the rare times when you watch a Dark Side of the Ring episode where you do see him being able to turn his life around, and telling the story of meeting his wife, who was helping him out when he was living on that park bench. And now it's kind of a full circle moment, as they showed at the end, with him now taking care of his wife, who's now in a home, and returning the favor to her. It is one of those times where it's like, at least considering what had happened to him beforehand, where it's still mind-boggling that he's still going and taking wrestling bookings at the age of 70 to try and take care of his ailing wife at this point. I mean, that is also kind of a sad indictment of what the professional wrestling business is, and how that could lead to a bigger conversation about how the WWE handles its talents after they're done performing for that company. But there is that kind of sadness to it, where it's like, man, this guy is still having to perform to try and make ends meet so that he can care for his wife. But all things considering, with all the episodes we've gone through, and I would imagine the future episodes will go through about other wrestlers' downfalls, whether it be through drugs or whatnot, that this is at least one of those stories where he's able to turn it around and be able to still live to tell his story and tell his career.
And I do want to make this about Tony Atlas, because you raise a good point, and I was going to make it myself, that at least at the end, the humanity and the naivety and the good person that Tony Atlas is came out, and was able to shine through, because that's what he does, to take care of his wife, the same woman that took care of him, living on a park bench and cared. And not all of these stories end that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say, and I don't want to digress too much from Tony Atlas, but you mentioned the Saba Simba, and it's a real sticking point with me. It's just hard to believe, and I just don't want these things to be overshadowed. Some of the things that Vince McMahon did when he either didn't like somebody, or he wanted to embarrass them, or maybe he thought it was a good idea that just didn't get over. But I did think in this show, watching the Saba Simba part, about getting this guy off of a park bench, knowing that, I'm going to give this guy a job, and he's going to be happier than just to have a job. So I'm going to do anything I want with this guy because I can. That attitude is just, it revolts me.
Yeah,
it literally revolts me. And to think that you can treat other human beings that way, I don't have a lot of love for Vince McMahon. I have a lot of disdain for him, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just another example of it. Like, that's the type of person, because I walked away from this show thinking, you know what? It's really sad, and Tony Atlas made some bad choices, and he's got to be responsible for those choices, but he's not a bad human being. Vince McMahon, even in the Tony Atlas Dark Side of the Ring, is a bad human being. And I don't need to watch this episode to know that Vince McMahon's a bad human being, but I was reminded of it again
Yeah.
in this episode. And it made me angry.
Yeah, it just reinforces that point, right? And about among the many, many, many things that Vince has been involved with when it comes to let's just go with controversial things that are tied to Vince McMahon. You just see the Saba Simba stuff, and it's just like, man, I don't want to go into his mindset. I don't really want to know how Vince's mind works at this point with everything that we know about him now, but it's just one after another. And like what you mentioned, just what you think that it's going to be something about Tony Atlas and you're going to see all the things. Vince always seems to find a way in a lot of these stories to kind of get himself into the story and be really a negative influence when it comes to everything. So yeah, that Saba Simba character is just like, I mean, I know people will say it was a different time, but I don't know about you, Lee. I really don't think even in 1990, this was something that could have flew very well in 1990.
No, and that's the thing. Yeah, you could get away with more, but this is a very simple example of he didn't bring Tony Atlas back into the company to make money. He just didn't.
Yeah.
He brought Tony Atlas back for power. He brought him back so that he could have power over somebody else. That's it. Like, and that's disgraceful to be able to do that. And when you go back and watch this, what's really interesting is what you think of Roddy Piper is this person who just shoots his mouth off all the time. And sometimes it got him in trouble. But in this case, it was like, there's a guy just telling the truth on television.
Yep.
Which Vince probably hated. You should tell him the truth. Maybe like Roddy Piper more. But getting back to Tony Atlas, I will at the end of this episode, I felt bad for him. It's like I wanted to help him. There's a part in this, and good for him for wanting to get into it, about the shoe fetish and people walking on his face. And I get, like, people have different things, and he was willing to bring it to light, and okay, that's good. What was really interesting, Zach, is at least he told the story, and you don't know that it's true, but you kind of feel like it might be, is that he turned down an opportunity to maybe win the championship and flew across the country to have a woman walk on his face instead of winning. Did they mention it was the WWF championship, or was it another belt? I wasn't quite sure.
They made it seem like it was the WWF championship, but I don't know if that's like, it wasn't like I don't know if it was like the WWF title or a WWF title.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I think it was a WWF title.
Yeah, I have a hard time believing that Tony Atlas was going to be world champion at one point.
Yeah, I do too, but it's very possible it could have been another title.
Yeah.
So he chose to not go to work that night so that he could have a woman walk on his face in shoes across the country, which also goes to show where people's minds were at. It's not about that, fetish in particular. It's about not kind of understanding the bigger picture of where you are and living in the moment again, right?
Yeah.
And spending money and doing the things that you wanted to do because no one was there to help you and tell you any different. So, in the ring, is there a Tony Atlas match for you? Because that was interesting to me at the end, where I'm like, I don't know, is there a Tony Atlas match that I would go back and watch and be really, really interested in?
Not really. There wasn't anything that like stuck out to me. If you wanted to watch for historical purposes, you could go back and watch the tag title match. But otherwise, there really isn't that one match where I could come on here and say, yeah, this is what Tony Atlas brought to the table when he was in the ring, because he was not the greatest wrestler in the world. I mean, he was kind of for him, it was kind of more the look with him when he was getting put over. And that's, they talked about the dynamic between he and Rocky Johnson, which, by the way, Rocky Johnson, I think would be a future Dark Side of the Ring candidate as well. I don't think people realize the dark side of Rocky Johnson. But having said that, in the case of Tony Atlas, he was more of a look guy. Like you see him and he's jacked and he's chiseled. But there wasn't really that one match that you could go back to and say, yeah, this is the match you got to go watch. Like, I believe he had a match with Flair in Georgia. I'm going to search it up right now as we're talking. I think he had a match with Flair for the title. I could be wrong, but I know that he had at least a match with Ric Flair, and I wonder how that match kind of turned out, because this is like prime Flair during that time, and you could get the most out of somebody. But otherwise, yeah, there's not really that one match.
Which is a very WWF Vince thing, even at the time, right?
Yeah.
That it was about the look. It was about, the charisma. It was about how people reacted to you. It was not about what was going on in the ring. So my final thought on Tony Atlas through all of this was Too Much Too Soon is, I think, a really good title, because I think it accurately describes the early life of Tony Atlas. And I have to give him some credit here. I think they've put him in some really bad situations because of the almighty dollar that he has needed, and even that Legends house, bad idea, making fun of people and making them kind of do things. But he was always in it for the dollar, and I give him a lot of credit for perseverance throughout his life. I really do. And to be there for his wife day in, day out now at her home and taking care of her, I think it's pretty amazing. I think it's a decent story on Dark Side of the Ring, how somebody went through so much to come out. He's still a pretty good person, Zach.
Absolutely. And it's especially impressive considering how you hear stories of guys that go through the wrestling business, and I see it from time to time too, even today, obviously not to this significant extent as we saw in the 70s and 80s, but you kind of go in with these visions of grandeur when it comes to pro wrestling, and you actually enter into the business and you realize how cutthroat and stone cold it could be. And it could really get, when a lot of people go through that industry, a lot of people could really sour on it and not look at life the same way, and look at everything through a negative lens. So the fact that Tony Atlas, with everything that he went through as a performer, from, the racism as we talked about, and also having to deal with some of the backstage personalities and everything that comes with pro wrestling, the fact that he's still able to look at life with at least a more positive outlook than you would your typical pro wrestler, I think it is an accomplishment, and something that you at least got a brighter ending to what you usually see with a Dark Side of the Ring episode.
Tony Atlas, Mr. USA, here on Dark Side of the Ring. For Zach McGibbon, I'm Lee Versage. Thanks again for listening to This Is Wrestling.